Every day, tens of thousands of people are searching up the rise of China. It's pretty rare to live through the obvious transfer of power from one superpower to another, and the common man just wants answers that aren't 2-hour lectures. But in any of the bite-sized content available, it's almost inevitably commentary that looks solely at Xi Jinping in the 2010s. Unfortunately, this only really explains the rise of the Chinese military and not how the Chinese economy grew to be powerful enough to fund this mega military that can rival the US. If you're likely to know a Chinese leader of history, it'd be Xi Jinping or Mao Zedong. However, in this video, I'm going to make a perhaps controversial argument that both of these leaders were less influential than today's leader. This is the leader who made China rich, and in this video, in basic terms, I'll explain to you exactly how. If you want to understand modern China, you have to understand Deng Xiaoping.
Hello there.
Okay, so I for one am really excited to get into Deng Xiaoping, and if you do go on to find this video helpful, make sure to hit the like button so that other people can find this when they search for the little man. And for today's question, I want to ask you this: should Deng Xiaoping be remembered as a hero for transforming the Chinese economy, or as a traitor for selling it out? So as a quick overview of his early life, Deng Xiaoping was born in 1904 and went to study in France throughout the 1920s. Now, while in France, he joined the Communist Party, and in early 1926, he went to Russia to study the Soviet model. Now, at the back end of the 1920s, he rose within the party ranks. However, he actually got demoted because he supported Mao Zedong. If you're tuning in for the first time, basically Mao was initially a renegade within the party because he believed that the revolution should begin with the peasants rather than the workers. However, though he was initially demoted, this decision proved to be a wise one on Deng's part. Chiang Kai-shek had purged much of China's communists, and as a decade-of-old leadership had failed, Mao Zedong emerged as the new leader of the Communist Party. And during the Communist Party's long march, where they fled from Jiangxi to Shanxi to avoid being captured by Chiang Kai-shek, Deng was promoted back to his old position, and he'd then be involved with the guerrilla campaign firstly against the Japanese, but then against Chiang's KMT in the Chinese Civil War. Once the Communist Party had defeated the Kuomintang in 1949, Mao had the tough job of bringing all the outskirt territories under his control, and he sent Deng to be the regional boss of Tibet, who had themselves declared independence from China in 1912 after the fall of the Qing dynasty.
You're hired.
And in the early 1950s, Mao had consolidated the Communist Party's power by putting high-ranking Kuomintang generals into key positions in the new Chinese army, and then by arresting over 2 million people who were deemed counter-revolutionaries. Now, yes, this is very extreme and wrong, might I add, but it is worth remembering that China was in a state of war for 2 decades, and the people were just desperate for stability and unity. But what this meant was that by 1956, Mao felt secure enough that he could now invite criticism upon the government in what he called the 100 Flowers campaign. Deng's role in this will be apparent soon, but Mao said that as 100 flowers bloom, 100 schools of thought should contend. You might think that that sounds way too pro-free speech to be Mao, and you're not wrong. For me, the best explanation is that after Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin earlier in 1956, Mao wanted to make himself look different to the late Soviet leader. Anyway, Mao got more criticism than he bargained for. For example, Zhou Enlai said that China should learn from confronting its mistakes like the Soviets had. And in 1958, there were 86 strikes in Shanghai, and so Mao brought the 100 Flowers campaign to an abrupt end. Mao said that rightists were using the campaign to try and bring down the government rather than offer constructive criticism, and that these were counter-revolutionaries that had to be purged. And so this is where Deng Xiaoping comes back into things. He was basically tasked with purging these rightists, which was shorthand for anyone who opposed the government during the campaign. And Deng was ruthless. In 1958, 53% of all criminal cases involved counter-revolutionary activity, and many intellectuals were placed into gulags without even facing trial.
He still assumes I'm a terrorist.
If you're not, I'm sorry. And if you are, I'm a hero. I'm willing to take that chance.
After the 100 Flowers campaign came Mao's Great Leap Forward, which, as I've discussed in this video, was an unprecedented disaster as 30 million Chinese died of starvation. Though there were natural factors that led to the famine, like locust plagues and floods, the newly collectivized farms lost any private incentive to produce, and the cadres of the farms fabricated their data to curry favor with Mao. As a result, in 1962, Mao took a backward step from governing China, and along with Liu Shaoqi and Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping went about undoing Mao's reforms. Work units were shrunk to just 30 people, and Deng even secured small plots of private land for farmers to cultivate. Understandably, this very much annoyed Mao, who promoted one of Deng's staffers, Kang Sheng, to be the head of the secret police and to ultimately spy on Deng.
The council wants you to report on all the Chancellor's dealings. They want to know what he's up to.
They want me to spy on the Chancellor.
In an effort to wrestle control of the party away from Deng's crew and to prevent any more capitalist policies from getting through, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966, where he encouraged university students to attack class enemies. One of these was Liu Shaoqi, who was stripped of his post in prison and then denied his diabetes medication. And while Mao's number 2, Lin Biao, criticised Liu Shaoqi, he went on to criticise Deng Xiaoping too. As Liu died from being denied his medication in 1969, the Red Guards visited Deng, who was forced to kneel and raise his hands in the aeroplane position for hours. He was then exiled and sent to work in a factory in Jiangxi. And to make matters worse, Deng's son, Deng Pefeng, was attacked by Red Guards at the top of Beijing University. They likely threw him off the building, leaving him handicapped, and they then hounded Deng's brother until he committed suicide. But while Deng was in exile, Mao's right-hand man, Lin Biao, died in a plane crash and Mao had no clear successor. The Cultural Revolution was also a nightmare. It eventually cost the Chinese $34 billion and Mao really needed Deng back, so he recalled him.
Albert? What's up, Roy? Hey, man.
Relax, man. I'm not gonna hit you.
Oh, I wouldn't.
But as Deng came back, he actually acquired more power than he'd ever previously enjoyed. He was vice chairman of the party, head of foreign affairs, and the acting premier of the state council. That's like being vice president, prime minister, and secretary of state all in one. And in his new powerful position, he began what he called the Four Modernizations, where China would invest in modernizing its industry, military, science, and technology. Now, unfortunately for Deng, Mao hadn't forgotten that Deng completely helped undo his Great Leap Forward, and so Mao's dying wish was that Deng be stripped of all his posts so that a new leader, Hua Guofeng, could take over from him unrivaled. The Politburo agreed, though Deng was still allowed to be a party member, and so upon Mao's death, Hua Guofeng was China's new chairman. Deng even voiced his support of Hua, but rightfully so, Hua was very suspicious of Deng, and he knew how much sway he had within the Chinese government. At Mao's funeral, Hua associated Deng with Liu Shaoqi as being a traitor of the movement, but the following year in 1977, Deng's supporters started to get vocal. For example, the new vice chairman Hu Yaobang voiced his support for Deng, and then in 1977, the Politburo agreed to put Deng Xiaoping back on it.
So I said, well, why don't you freaking write one? So I gave him the pen and paper, and he just wrote. That's all you needed to say.
Now, Hua Guofeng's 10-year plan to modernize industry failed badly, and China started to suffer from inflation. Then in 1980, Hua was forced to allow all those who were purged by Mao in the Cultural Revolution to return, which meant that by his association with Mao, they were all anti-Hua and incredibly pro-Deng. Ultimately, in 1981, Hua resigned altogether. Now, technically, Hu Yaobang took over from Hua Guofeng as the chairman of the party, and technically, Deng Xiaoping was actually the third highest ranking party member behind Zhao Ziyang also. However, as Hu himself admitted, Deng was the supreme decision maker. And effectively, Zhao answered to Deng on economic matters, while Hu answered to Deng on political matters. And so with Deng Xiaoping now in charge, we really started to see China transform to a commercial powerhouse in the 1980s. If we go back to 1978, 250 million people were living in absolute poverty, and capitalist and US supported Taiwan seemed to be faring much better. Now, a lot of commentators provide a pretty lazy commentary for what changed, and you might have heard of it. It goes something like this.
How did one of the world's poorest countries, China, become, in 30 years, one of the world's richest? There is one word answer: capitalism.
But that is not giving enough credit to Deng Xiaoping, who constantly interfered with the market in the 1980s. Now, firstly, Deng was adamant that China's economic system be changed before its political system. He thought his Russian counterpart, Mikhail Gorbachev, was silly to allow democratic reforms before changing the economic system because he'd be voted out for being seen to make the Russians poor. Instead, Deng broke from regular communist thinking, and rather than splitting the nation's wealth evenly, he went on record saying that for China to keep up with the world, some people had to get rich first. And so basically, there are a lot of ways in which Deng reformed the economy, but for time purposes, we're just going to look at 4. Firstly, he set up what were called special economic zones where a particular province would be given lower taxes and extra government subsidies. This encouraged businesses from other countries, like say Macca's, to set up in that zone, hiring Chinese workers and paying corporate tax to the Chinese government. Shenzhen was the first of these special economic zones, and then by 1985, a dozen more were added, including Shanghai and Guangzhou. Annual exports also grew from $10 billion to $25 billion, with 30% growth each year. Secondly, farmers were given quotas of grain to yield to the government, but any surplus could be sold on the private market. The price of grain paid to farmers by the government was also up by 20%, and the exact price per bushel depended on how much grain you produced in total, incentivizing farmers to grow more. Deng also lowered the price of equipment like tractors, and this caused Chinese agricultural output to increase by 8 to 10% each year. Thirdly, the hukou system allowed workers to get temporary migrant status to the SEZs, but because it was only temporary, the workers would then bring that wealth back to the home province. And then finally, China had great success in global trade as they got loans from the IMF and the World Bank. And then the Plaza Accord increased the value of the Japanese yen, which made other nations more incentivized to import from China rather than Japan. As a side note, in the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping also reached an agreement with Margaret Thatcher to take control of Hong Kong in 1997. The net result of all of these reforms was that roughly 70% of those living in absolute poverty were lifted out. So Deng Xiaoping was now a national hero, right? Well, not quite. Deng's reforms were experimental rather than, say, closely planned out 4D chess, and this huge influx of foreign currency led to quite bad inflation. And so by the end of the 1980s, there was a lot of frustration brewing amongst the Chinese. They were annoyed at the inflation, annoyed at the rampant corruption that had emerged in these special economic zones, and annoyed that Deng hadn't made steps towards being democratic like Gorbachev had in the Soviet Union. And so a perfect storm really brewed here. The chairman, Hu Yaobang, had championed democracy, but he died of a heart attack in April 1989. 10,000 demonstrators then lined the streets paying tribute to him. Then in May, Gorbachev himself arrived in Beijing. And knowing that the world's eyes would be on Beijing for the week, pro-democracy and anti-corruption demonstrators lined the streets, numbering 100,000. As pressure grew on Deng Xiaoping, he said that the more they made concessions to the public, the easier the government would fall, citing Poland as an example. On May the 18th, Deng declared martial law, and then in June, the Tiananmen Square massacre took place as the army cleared out the streets using deadly force. You can check out my video on it here. Deng was 85 when the massacre took place and simply didn't have the energy to keep going. He was going deaf and mute and needed to communicate through his daughter, and so he resigned his post and handed over leadership of the party to Jiang Zemin. But as Jiang Zemin took over, a fellow party official, Chen Yun, wanted to scale back Deng's reforms that he'd made in the 1980s and gained 35 signatures to oppose Deng's peaceful evolution from Maoism. At this point, it was uncertain what Jiang would do, and so Deng got up one more time to influence the Middle Kingdom. In 1992, he went on his southern tour across the special economic zones, advocating for the need to retain his policies. This created enough public momentum that Jiang ultimately decided that it'd be unwise to side with Chen Yun.
The Supreme Leader is wise.
Instead, he sided with Deng, and the State Council issued a 54-point decree actually increasing the freedoms of state-run enterprises. In February of 1997, Deng Xiaoping died, and it was really strange for China. There were 6 days of mourning and he had an open casket funeral, but think about this. He was there for the Long March, the Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese Civil War, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. He was leader throughout all the 1980s, and even on the verge of death, he still influenced Chinese policy with his southern tour. Though not remembered quite as much as Mao, the little man certainly shaped our current world beyond belief. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video on Deng Xiaoping, you really need to also check out this video here on Deng's ally, Zhou Enlai, who played a pivotal role in shaping the early Communist Party, and really fills in a lot of the blanks that we didn't get to include in this video. Click the link here. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.